I wish that I could be there today. I'd like to dedicate this talk to my dear colleague, Patty Scannell, who joined the chorus of influential voices that have helped me work through the ideas that I'll discuss today. Much of my research trajectory over the last 2 decades has examined the shifting industrial norms of television. Most of that work focused on the US, and it has recently begun to look at the period from the 1990s to the present more broadly. A lot of that investigation looks at changes in the business, the rise, and in some markets, dominance of cable and satellite that eroded television's characteristic of drawing mass audiences to particular titles, of shifts in business models, from advertising and public service to subscriber payment, and technological changes that made profoundly different experiences of television possible. Curiously, I often talk about everything but the television shows, although they are the starting point of my inquiries and the reason why I have found myself down deep rabbit holes reading economic and business theory. The animating question behind much of my research is how do changes in television's industrial norms produce changes in its texts? A question I find important because of a belief about the role of those texts, or I prefer stories, in culture. This question has required me to split my brain between the past, of understanding the history of television and its industrial conditions, and balancing that with thinking that carefully lifts those historical frames to be alive to the possibility of new formations. It is a constant struggle within the work that involves always first asking, is this really new? What like this has happened before? But to also not limit my conceptualization of developments to thinking of them exclusively through how things have worked. Of course, another layer to that challenge is that the history differs significantly around the globe. And I do understand the norms in my head are different from the norms for many of you. Shaped as I was by US television in the 1970s and 80s, I would assert that US television of that era was considerably constrained by commercial forces and the hegemony of advertiser support. To some degree, US television of that era earned its critique as a boob tube and a mechanism by which we might amuse ourselves to death, as suggested by popular analysis at the time. Though I believe the causation of those assertions is misunderstood. It was not television that was bad. It was a certain set of industrial norms that encouraged, at best, middling content. Rather than rage against television, critics should have raged against advertiser funding. Notably, the exact same forces have and continue to diminish news outside of public funding models. The extent to which our media are constrained by reliance on advertising is something we do not talk about enough. The problems with US television weren't problems with television, but with its funding model. Asserting under-accomplishment of US network television can lead me into tricky territory within the cultural studies theoretical framework with which I identify. I'm not talking about cultural capital here, nor am I critiquing audiences that found stories that deeply resonated or provided enough entertainment to make life tolerable. I believe it can be asserted that in industrial terms, advertiser funding is a mechanism for paying for television that relies on metrics of success that discourage creativity and innovation. Of course, there were moments of exception in those long decades when the US network era, when creativity and innovation broke through, despite the tram tracks headed toward mediocrity. But generally, the reliance on advertisers limited the range of storytelling produced and limited television as a medium in the United States due to the lack of significant public funding structures and alternative metrics of success. And importantly, I assert no evaluation of the audiences that tolerated and adored that content. Indeed, I was among them. For far too long, our conversations about artistic or narrative accomplishment have swung too quickly into heralding quality and ignored the structuring industrial dynamics that often explain the accomplishment possible. My investigation of the evolution or revolution of television began because the US television I watched night after night began to change, and I wanted to understand why. That inquiry began with explaining the unprecedented success of female-centered dramas in the late 1990s. While post-feminism, understood here as a kind of feminism, not its opposite, conceptually circulated at the time, it seemed an inadequate explanation. Rather, better evidence could be marshaled that the sudden prevalence of female-centered storytelling was rooted in industrial shift. My search for answers led me very unintentionally to look deeper at what had been happening in U.S. television. A series of changes, first really explored by Herman Gray, that might be described simply as fragmentation. Those questions led to The Television Will Be Revolutionized, first before streaming, and then in a second edition that addressed the first phase of streaming. It also led to examination of the implications of cable and satellite channels in the U.S. on storytelling, specifically about masculinity, as well as more generally in We Now Disrupt This Broadcast. This trajectory of research has been rooted in an appreciation for how and why historical norms produced one textual universe, how fragmentation, driven by channel choice and conglomeration, then led to changes, and most recently, to how subscriber and on-demand access, made available by streaming services, have reset the norms again. The theme of the first part of the talk is of the importance of understanding the history of media, yet of simultaneously not being bound by it. Television and its history have been crucial analytic tools in my more recent work aimed at conceptualizing streaming video services. Developing frameworks for understanding streaming services can be tricky terrain, and my focus here is just on the subscriber-funded ones, not YouTube, TikTok, and other forms of social media. Over the past 2 decades, I've been polled by popular journalism and reviewers occupying 2 roles of a continuum. One camp, especially early on, took a celebratory perspective and was quick to identify streamers as new media that might deliver us from all the limits of the past, while another group looked on skeptically, maybe even with disinterest, taking the position that there is nothing new here. The easy line that I've used to deflect critiques from both sides is one of change and continuity. It is obviously the case and a bit of a cop-out. I have tried to take my work beyond describing what has happened, that there is change and continuity, to also address why it matters, initially in tentative ways, increasingly with more certainty, and along a path that might be described as theory building. I suppose that only I have really been aware that the trajectory of this industrially focused research I've endeavored upon for the last 2 decades was all about establishing a foundation to ask questions about television stories and their role in culture. I haven't written often about the texts, although I watch a lot, and they are in the background of my inquiries. My work has somewhat taken for granted that television content has changed, although personally I've not constructed extensive analyses detailing how beyond the gender books. I have appreciated reviewers that have kept me focused on acknowledging the simultaneous change and continuity, because the possibility of change, especially coming from the US context, has been far more exciting intellectually than continuing to repeat the same well-worn analyses. But I also want to talk about the ways that being historically astute can shape our paradigms of understanding and limit our openness to the roots of novelty that should not be dismissed or disciplined into existing frameworks. In invoking hegemony in my title, I do so to reference hegemonies of thinking and understanding developed through our theorization of past technologies and stages of cultural formation of objects or distribution technologies such as television. This isn't hegemony in its explanation of the operation of power sense, although, of course, there is always the operation of power. At the outset, let's be clear. There was nothing normal or natural about the norms of television from its origins up through roughly the 1990s, Precise dates vary by country, but I'm referencing the transition from scarcity to abundance that was also a transition to privatized commercial channels, becoming more dominant in some places. Similarly, when cable and satellite arrived, it became, in time, normal that this service might reach half of a country's population, and that once you had the service, you tended to keep it. What we generally think of as normal, or how television is supposed to be, are neither. Certain norms developed out of particular conditions. Those conditions are a mess of inextricable regulatory, industrial, and cultural factors that shaped the range of possible action that those who made and circulated television could take. As conditions have changed, for instance, technologies have allowed different affordances and business strategies. Adjustments have transpired, on down through the system like a chain of dominoes. I've said and written this next bit before, but I don't assume all are across my full works, so I'll review in brief. Early in the century, when we'd have entire conferences on what is television, Lynn Spiegel helpfully demarcated that culturally, we could understand television as designated not only by technology, which was the only thing clearly shifting at that time, but also by industrial norms, viewing practices, and regulatory structures. In the nearly 20 years since that publication, many more things have changed. Viewing practices have evolved profoundly. I don't believe in the gospel of replacement, that streaming is killing off broadcasting. But we've clearly entered a stage in several countries where streaming services are the preferred distributor of fictional storytelling. And that's more about the experience than the idea that streaming services offer different stories. Industrial norms, too, have changed, significantly in the last decade. These vary by country, so I'll locate these comments specifically in the US. It is astounding to me that 22-episode seasons and broadcasters' commissions were the center of the dramatic television universe when I began this work, and I'm not sure any such shows remain. It makes me feel like the oldest living human. The worlds of those who make television have also changed extraordinarily. Many more voices and ideas are now shared on screens, but the nature of working in television, of how one gets paid, of what a successful career looks like, is now unrecognizable to those who began in the last century. And in recent years, we see the regulatory structures trying to catch up. It is for all those reasons that I've come to claim with certainty that what has developed warrants consideration as a revolution rather than evolution. It was not the case in 2004. It wasn't clear a decade later in 2014, but there can be no mistaking the scale of change at this point. With substantive change apparent, and of course, still some continuity, the crucial task becomes conceptualizing the characteristics of the new distribution technologies and their implications throughout processes of production and consumption. It requires revisiting the theory and frameworks built for another time and another set of norms. If we're honest, the multi-channel choice of cable and satellite had made many of these theories of mass audiences pretty shaky. But digital technologies and their forecast change arrived too quickly to properly address that late 20th century disruption. A lot of the thinking being applied to streaming services often fails to understand the profound alteration of the industrial conditions of television of the network era, or TV1, and post-multi-channel industrial conditions. Similarly, too often analysis fails to recognize the significant differences undergirding advertiser and subscriber-funded television. The different source of revenue produces different measures of success, altering the very reason, purpose, and motivations by which the industrial act of making television occurs. Within analysis of television, this failure of context translation has led to two mistaken frames that assume characteristics of historical norms as immutable. I've described them as the hegemony of linear norms and the hegemony of demographic thinking, and they prevent us from analyzing streaming services according to their own dynamics. The hegemony of linear norms uses past practice as a benchmark of best practice. For example, the assumption that titles that attract the most attention succeed more than those that attract fewer. That is true in the case of linear ad-supported television, but not for subscriber-funded, bundled services. The hegemony of linear norms leads us as particularly Americans in this example, to believe titles with hundreds of episodes are more successful than those with fewer. Again, the industrial dynamics of deficit funding and reliance on window after window of resale required those hundreds of episodes, which is a thing that might not be obvious unless you're well across the industrial dynamics. In contrast, on-demand libraries, unconcerned with the rigors of scheduling, more effectively find value in stories with many and few hours. I will spare you the detailed industrial analysis of how the economics of these two types of services differ. In return, I ask you to accept my supposition that the differences in industrial features produces different content priorities and metrics of success. We can respect history and also contextualize conditions that have changed and require us to think in terms of different metrics and priorities. The hegemony of demographic thinking works similarly. And again, I'm counterposing linear ad-supported services, not publicly funded ones. Many of us have internalized entire systems of thinking based on strategies developed for television as defined by conditions in which the audience was largely unknowable to channels and creators. Very basic demographic features, age, gender, maybe income, could be known about a discrete audience watching a particular show at a particular time. And this worked because it suited the dominant funding system of advertising that built its norms on buying the attention of particular people of particular ages at particular times. We built inferences about likes and dislikes off this demographic data because it was all we had. And we believed that we saw a universe of viewing behavior when we only had viewing data about what people did when offered the tip of the iceberg in terms of possible stories. Demographic thinking blinds us to the discrepant strategies of subscriber-funded streaming services and how they have no reason to sort us by identity features, and instead are able to sort us by our viewing behavior. The combination of subscriber funding and the affordance of on-demand access enable different strategies, and those strategies are measured in ways other than what shows gather the most attention. Part of the issue here is the opacity of what is being watched, and that the only thing we know, at least in the case of Netflix, is about what is most watched. But don't be misled into believing that the top 10 titles are of outsized importance. Of course, historical framing is crucial, and as someone who has spent much of her career trying to make sense of new industrial formations, I can attest that turning to historical precedent can make the work so much easier. My understanding of the early 21st century period of television reconfiguration is deeply informed by my knowledge of what happened to U.S. radio when television emerged. Radio is such a survivor. Similar to prognostication of the demise of television and its replacement by streaming, forecasts of death faced radio in the 1950s, as the prospects of television seemed to completely undermine it, at least in the U.S. As successful radio dramas and comedies transitioned to television, many fretted over what would become of radio and its obituary written. But radio didn't die. U.S. commercial radio did exactly what we've begun to see linear television do. Its leaders identified the affordances of television that radio couldn't compete with. Drama and comedy with pictures have extraordinary advantage. They were sectors of programming to be lost. But being an oral medium allows other opportunities. Oral media can be companions while your visual register is otherwise occupied. And for decades, oral media were far more portable. Radio didn't die. It pivoted to become a complement rather than try to compete with television in offering program forms for which its offering was inferior. In going back to the scholarship about that time, this passage by Michelle Hilmes struck me as relevant. It was not advertiser abandonment of radio that motivated the rapid removal of network assets from the old medium to the new. Rather, networks made a deliberate policy decision to concentrate development in the new technology, where sales potential was vast and regulatory conditions favorable, at the expense of radio. Hilmes goes on to note how U.S. radio then shifted to be far more youth-focused than television, which was trying to satisfy viewers from the cradle to the grave on just 3 channels. And also how she discovered that what was described as black format radio expanded from 4 to 400 stations in just 2 years in the mid-1950s. Historians such as Hilmes, Eric Barnow, and William Boddy have shown that rather than dying, radio was used to support the establishment of television. It then metamorphosized to play a different role in culture, and we now know that it has persisted through another half-century. That's the example I trot out whenever I'm asked what will happen to broadcasters in this age of streaming. The fate of broadcasters depends on their ability to similarly recognize their relative strengths and to seek complementarity with newer forms of video distribution that have different affordances. The fate of broadcasters is actually far more dependent on advertisers continuing to value what they offer and to stem the tide of advertising dollars shifting from television to search and social media that has begun to be evident in some countries. Certain kinds of television, often sport, often reality competitions, different things in different countries, continue to provide the most mass advertising opportunity, which is highly valued by some advertisers. It offers a kind of attention very much in demand. But scripted content is tough terrain for linear, and especially ad-supported services. Once, the notion of radio without dramas and comedies was impossible to imagine, yet it has come to pass in many places. Today, it might be as impossible to imagine television without these forms, but that may also come to be. What does television become in our cultural imagination if you take away the dramas, comedies, and movies? Maybe not all, but probably most, at least first run. Maybe a lot of the channels, too. It can still be television, just as the case with radio. Television, but different. To be clear, I have not come to a conference on television history to kill television, but to suggest we are at an inflection point that requires a hard look at how pregnant a signifier television has become. Television became the term and conceptual frame for most in-home video over the last 70 years, and that was a misstep. Over the decades, we have come to use it for so many things that it is bursting, and it encompasses different formats of programming, different business models, and different distribution technologies. It is a technology and a category of video programming that can mean anything from any form of content viewed on a television to a kind of episodic storytelling historically set in contrast to movies. 20 years ago, if I would have walked into a hotel room and it had no television, I'd have had no access to a universe of video experience. But today, my main concern is that my hotel rooms have good Wi-Fi. It wasn't actually television that I wanted before, but access to video storytelling. Likewise, in this time of change and greater multiplicity of video storytelling providers, those of us who think critically on these things need to be careful, precise, and deliberate if we are to do the work that is most needed. calling something a television show also lumped together public service and commercial television broadcasters that had different purposes and in many cases funding sources. And it conflated the content of cable and satellite channels that required some fee with those public service and commercial broadcasters, as well as those fully reliant on subscriber payment. Though many of us bristled at HBO's early 2000s brand positioning as not TV, industrially, it was a fair point. What I liked about Spiegel's formulation was how it captured the way we also use the word television to identify the breadth of content that comes through it, our experience of that content, and its role in everyday life. At one time, there was enough uniformity in the technology, industrial practices, viewing routines, and government regulations for television to meaningfully signify. But I think that moment has passed. The rupture we face has as much to do with how we've forced more into the range of what was television, or what television has been meant to signify, as with the new distribution technologies that have emerged, first with cable and satellite, and more recently with internet-distributed video. We rarely made distinctions about the different industrial conditions supporting the content delivered through the box. Constructions like Spiegel's that acknowledged that television had come to mean many things, practices, text, technology, helped us appreciate the uncertainty internet-distributed video was initiating, but didn't really make us sort it out. And it might be time for that. I'm not claiming to be in charge of such things, but here is a proposal. We need to revisit our terminology, make strange some of the looseness we've adopted, and unpack television. And let me be clear at the outset, this is not an act of evaluative hierarchies or reserving cultural capital for some forms of video and not others. That historical baggage of perceived differences between television and film, differences that were not inherent to these media, but tied to their industrial conditions at a particular moment in their history, have gotten in the way for far too long. To again briefly summarize something I've written on more extensively, Henry Jenkins helpfully distinguishes between media and distribution technologies. Media persist. Media are technologies that allow communication. Per Lisa Gittleman, they enable the sharing of words, sounds, pictures, video, and also develop associated cultural systems. But distribution technologies, such as broadcasting, newspapers on rags and maybe paper, 8-track tapes, they change and do disappear. That was a crucial conceptual click for me when I started to sort out what streaming services like Netflix were doing. They were not new media, as once widely held, but a manifestation of a new distribution technology for video. Television is not only a technology of communication, but engaged in a cultural system, or, per Gittleman, a set of associated protocols or social and cultural practices that have grown up around the technology. These are things like schedules, channels, our expectation of what breakfast programs entail. Many of television's protocols tie to its initial distribution technology of broadcasting. Previous new distribution technologies, such as cable and satellite, largely assumed those protocols, even though there were notable differences in the industrial conditions. But streaming, internet distribution has different affordances, and that has led to different protocols. My proposal is a call for critical reflection on how we categorize the field of video and its technologies connected to its use. And part of that involves not imagining that all video that can come through devices or sets that we still call televisions to be understood as television. In other words, maintain television as based on pre-internet protocols, a technology and experience that persists alongside video streaming. I've come to quite like the word video. At first, I had trouble distancing it from an association with video cassette tapes. But now, reverting to perhaps the most basic conceptualization of a medium of communication has been vital to making strange the conditions that have led to our confusion about the boundaries of television, and increasingly, film in the last decade. Video is a broad category, and depending on your question, it may be useful to organize it in different ways. There is little true of all video, so we need systems of classification that are not laden with evaluation or cultural capital to delimit the scope of our interventions. Our thinking about video has been structured by industrial conditions tied to distribution technologies, but we've rarely acknowledged those structures because we couldn't see them. Streaming has laid those structures bare, and we need to denaturalize those features. I committed that basic sin of unspecificity in titling today's talk. Is it really television that I've spoken of today, or has most of my intervention understood television as fictional series? As we move into what looks like a more multifaceted environment than the largely binary one of movies and television, we need to tend more to our classifications of video and be certain of their categorical consistency. I expect television to persist through my lifetime, but I also expect television by 2030 to exhibit the scale of distinction from television in 2010 as contrasts U.S. radio in 1940 versus 1960. Today, in my mind, television is usefully bound to linear delivery. It is not about live, or it is about live, but if not actually airing live, it is about the liveness of scheduled programming and a certain kind of temporality that has not been characteristic of most media. Consider books or albums. Admittedly, the bits that have mostly been television to me are breaking away. And maybe that means I need to break away too. It isn't that I've come to kill television, but I've come to unbundle its overflowing signification. And I'm not doing so for evaluative purposes or out of neophilia, but for the conceptual clarity needed to categorize and sort the 21st century video ecosystem in ways relevant to current conditions. Maybe I've had the question wrong all along. Maybe it wasn't evolution versus revolution. Maybe it is metamorphosis, but it is not a complete change in substance, form, and structure. Rather, it is a casting off of some features, an adaptation, but with plurality, not replacement. Television history remains a crucial area of exploration. It is in the work, particularly of those who studied the industry in the 1950s, that I have turned to again and again as I've tried to make sense of the new and rapidly shifting formations of streaming over the last decade. The scale of change over what still feels like a brief career to me takes my breath away. With nearly every publication, I've struggled with the question of whether it is too soon to write, of whether whatever I offer will be out of date before it finds its way into a reader's hands. One of the nicest compliments I've received was being described as a historian of the present, which speaks generously of my attempt to develop systematic understandings of industrial dynamics and their consequences in the near term. It may seem that the present world of streaming and many other new technologies is far removed from the past, but I don't have to tell this audience that it is far from so. The new lenses those streaming technologies offer are also helpful for historical practice. They help us to break the hegemonies and denaturalize the bits that we assumed were inherent, but were actually constructed by particular industrial dynamics or technological affordances. On this occasion of the celebration of 70 years of television in the Netherlands, we are no more at the end of television than we were at the end of radio at the dawn of the 1950s. As the papers offered illustrate, and William Uricchio has long argued, television has been in a constant state of evolution. But to keep television alive and conceptually meaningful, we do need to allow boundaries, to confine it to certain industrial practices, viewing routines, and government policies, if not technologies. New distribution technologies, such as streaming, may require reconfiguration of its characteristic program forms and lead to adaptation of our everyday routines in which it has long been integrated. But television lives on. Thank you.